Imagine a legal system where you could be sued for buying a fish. What would life be like if anyone who owned a mirror or who wrote love poetry could face legal retribution? Would you marry for love if you thought your in-laws might accuse you of bewitching your spouse in order to steal their money? Long gone are the days of hunting witches in the American colonies, or under James VI, or during the brutal years of the Spanish Inquisition. But legal protections for magical practitioners is a relatively new and by no means universal standard. Even in the superstitious world of ancient Rome, where cursing was a favorite pastime across all social strata, regulation of magical activities meant that witches had to be careful. Extant materials on how the Roman justice system dealt with spellcasters, astrologers, and their kind are sadly few and far between. But amid the murk and mystery is a speech, preserved from a trial on Rome's African frontier during the reign of Antoninus Pius. The well-known polymath Apuleius must defend himself against an accusation that he used his knowledge of erotic spells to trick his wife into marrying him, so that he could have access to her riches. Today, we're taking a look at the enumeration of the charges against him that Apuleius lays out, and his point-by-point rebuttal of each one. Was he guilty of strange behaviors and dark practices, or a misunderstood and curious student of the natural world? The answer depends on who you ask. Hey everyone, welcome to Hearth of Haemonia. My name is Kate, and today we are finishing up our discussion of the work and life of Apuleius of Medauros. This is part 3 in the series. If you've missed episodes 1 and 2, I'll link them up here and in the description, so you can go ahead and watch those first. If you've read this speech or have read parts of it, you know it's very substantial, it's long, it's super packed with all sorts of juicy bits of information. We get a glimpse into what it was like to live in Rome's provinces and the role that magic, the belief in magic, the practice of magic had in the lives of everyday people. This is a speech that Apuleius gives in his own defense, and we know that he was part of the philosophical and general intellectual movement of the Second Sophistic, which really prioritized rhetorical skill, being able to speak well, being able to convince people of whatever it is you are trying to persuade them to think or to do. So beginning with the title of the work, this is called the Apologia, and if you think it sounds like the word apology in English, you would be right, although they do not mean the same thing. Apologia comes from Greek, as things so often do on this channel, and it literally just means a defense speech. You may have heard of another apologia from classical history, and that's the speech that Socrates gave in his own self-defense, which we have recorded by his student Plato, when he was brought up on trial basically for being a public nuisance, for harassing people in the street, for being atheist, and for corrupting the youth. That's not the subject of today's video, but this speech by Apuleius is in the same spirit as the Socrates speech. Apuleius's trial took place sometime in the late 150s or early 160s CE. This would have been the reign of Antoninus Pius, who was the emperor right before Marcus Aurelius. So this is the golden era of Roman imperialism. We're pretty much at the point where Rome is at its widest extent, which it reached in 117 under Trajan, and the trial takes place in one of Rome's provincial towns, a place called Sabratha. Sabratha is one of 3 cities in modern-day Tripoli in Libya. The other 2 are Oia, which I'm definitely not saying right, and Leptis Magna. Leptis Magna was the main urban center, it was the biggest of the 3 cities, and it was where most of the action took place. And even though the trial is conducted in Sabratha, the events that are being discussed took place in Oia. The reason the trial takes place in Sabratha is because the Roman proconsul for the province of Africa is visiting that town where he will preside over certain court cases, including this one. The speech is given in Latin, which was the language that the trial would have been conducted in. At this point in Rome's history, Latin is still the predominant administrative language. Eventually, it will become Greek some centuries later, when the capital is moved from Rome to Constantinople. But for now, everything is still done in Latin. But Apuleius makes very frequent reference to works in not only Latin but Greek as well, and he mentions that a number of the people involved in the trial speak the native language of Punic. And even though Apuleius is of Roman descent and he's on trial in the Roman justice system, this is a trial that is taking place in North Africa. So you're going to get people who don't speak that much Latin or don't speak Latin very well. Certainly almost nobody would have spoken Greek here except for the super elite educated classes. Now that includes the proconsul Claudius Maximus, who is the judge. So Apuleius can make reference to Greek works and assume that Claudius Maximus knows what he's talking about. As for everyone else, Apuleius spends a lot of time making fun of them for not knowing Greek, in particular for using Punic as their main language. Like I said, Punic would have been a totally normal and very commonly understood language in this area, but for Apuleius, it was a sign of being a provincial bumpkin, for lack of a better word. So he uses this against the prosecution at various points throughout the speech. The key players in this trial are obviously Apuleius, he is the defendant. His wife, Pudentilla, she is a local wealthy woman who has been widowed, and Apuleius is her second husband. The judge, Claudius Maximus, a lot of Pudentilla's family is involved in this trial. So the main accuser of Apuleius is a guy named Sicinius Aemilianus, and he is the brother of Pudentilla's first husband, so he is her brother-in-law. Her older son, Pontianus, has passed away. Apuleius speaks very highly of him, but her younger son, Sicinius Pudens, is one of the accusers. We don't get an actual age for how old Pudens is, but he's gotta be no more than 15 or 16 years old, just based on the fact that Apuleius says at one point that he's too young to be punished for perjury. But he's old enough, evidently, to appear in court and to give testimony. The lawyer for the prosecution is this guy named Antoninus Pius. We don't hear too much about him other than the fact that he is a professional accuser, according to Apuleius. So he makes his money by bringing up people on random lawsuits. And then there's 2 more people on the side of the prosecution that we hear about. The first is Herennius Rufinus, who is the father-in-law of Pudentilla's older son, Pontianus, who again is now deceased. And the last guy is Junius Crassus. Crassus is not present at the trial, but his written testimony is presented as part of the prosecution's accusation, and Apuleius characterizes him as a drunken fool who gave his testimony for money, and everybody knows. We'll get into the details of the charges later, but suffice it to say that the main charge is that Apuleius seduced Pudentilla into marrying him through the use of erotic magic. And then all of the other charges and accusations are kind of just there to support the characterization of Apuleius as a magician. At the end of the speech, Apuleius alludes to the fact that this is a capital charge, but at least according to scholars like Keith Bradley, it's unlikely that Apuleius would have been executed for this if he were found guilty. More likely he would have been sent into exile from the city of Oia. The other accusations against him range from substantial and serious to almost ridiculous. And that's the point that Apuleius tries to make throughout. So we'll see him sort of dismantling these charges one by one. One of the reasons this speech is so valuable to us is because of the detail we get about the viewpoints that people had on magic. Apuleius talks about the nature of magic and where it fits into other intellectual disciplines and where it falls on the scale of acceptable to not acceptable, and he gives several definitions for what a magician might be. This is part of a larger discussion that was going on in antiquity and still goes on today. I like to call it the Great Debate, which is magic versus religion versus science versus philosophy. As I've said a number of times already on this channel, the lines between these disciplines were much more porous than we may imagine because we have sort of codified disciplines today. If you were taking a philosophy class and a biology class, they would be probably in two different buildings, but in antiquity, they may have been taught by the same person, even in the same breath. Firstly, he gives two different definitions for what a magician is. In other words, how do you define a magician and who qualifies as a magician? The first definition he gives is linguistic. He says that the Latin magus and the Greek magos, or magoi in the plural, refers to the official priests of Persian state religion. These people would have been recognized by the Persian king, and their activities would have been acceptable in the eyes of the state, the Persian state. And Apuleius says if that's the case, then clearly the gods are okay with magic, because if the magoi are practicing magic, then the gods must allow it to happen because the magoi are priests of the gods, the Persian gods, but Rome was a big fan of everybody's gods anyway. So he says for that reason, if that's what a magician is, then everybody should be fine with it. But he says not a lot of people believe in that definition. He says there's a much more common and popular definition that says that magicians are big, scary bad guys who can do all sorts of stuff. They're dangerous, they're malicious, and they should be avoided. And he says if that's your definition of magician, and you're saying that I'm a magician, why would you dare to cross me by bringing me up on trial? This is a major inconvenience for me, and if you're saying that I'm so powerful, shouldn't you be afraid to cross me? Which I think is a brilliant argument. When Apuleius compares magic to other disciplines, which he does not systematically as I'm about to present it, but sort of peppered throughout the speech, this is what he has to say. First, a lot of the activities that the prosecution says are magic, Apuleius says they're just science. Learning how stuff works. Things like mirrors and light and reflections and animals and different aspects of nature. Studying those things doesn't necessarily mean using them for magical intent. And the other thing that he says is that certain remedies are considered magical. They include things like incantation, herbalism, and so on. And he says if those things are magic, if magic is used for healing, what is so wrong about healing people? His argument is very similar for philosophy. He says a lot of what you're describing, a lot of my activities are not magic, but just philosophy. And he cites famous philosophers, beginning with and especially Plato, because we know he loves Plato. He says these guys were doing all of these things too. You're not calling them magicians because they're obviously philosophers. And likewise with religion. He brings up his own religious beliefs on a couple of occasions, talking about a little statue that he has of the god Mercury that he prays to, which the prosecution tries to use against him. We'll talk about that in a minute. And he makes reference to his initiation into certain mystery cults. Some of the behavior that the prosecution says is magic spells or rituals or secret magical objects. Apuleius says that all of that is related to his devotion to mystery cults. And one thing that I think is interesting about that is that he just assumes that everybody's totally fine with mystery cults. We know that they were very common, we know that there were a lot of them and that a lot of people were initiated into them, but we don't know for sure that they were a fully accepted aspect of state religion. So I just thought that was interesting as well. So he begins the sort of body of this speech by defending himself against what he considers to be frivolous accusations thrown out by the prosecution, either in desperation to just get him on something, or in my view, and I'll talk about it, why I think this way, to sort of bolster the characterization of Apuleius as a magical practitioner, or also to provide a motive why he may have done what they're accusing him of doing, which is seducing his wife using magic. So the first thing, which is mentioned offhand and never brought up again, is the accusation that Apuleius murdered his stepson Pontianus. He says, "You guys have been going around talking about this for the last couple of days. Here we are today. Why haven't you said anything about it?" Oh, I should also say, before I actually get into this, that the prosecution has already spoken. So Apuleius is able to respond to some of the things that the prosecution has brought up today on this day of the trial. Apparently the prosecution has been going around accusing Apuleius of murdering his stepson, and Apuleius says, "Why haven't you brought that up?" Oh, it's probably because there's literally no proof of that at all. And that's just something that you invented in the last couple of days, and there's nothing to it. So he starts the speech with that, and then he kind of just lets it go. The other frivolous accusations are, Apuleius is a bilingual philosopher and orator who is proficient and eloquent in both Latin and Greek. He's handsome. Maybe they're saying this to tell the judge not to be swayed by his good looks. Maybe they're saying that he used his good looks to seduce his wife. Who knows? He owns and carries and even uses a mirror. Now, mirrors would have been a kind of rare and definitely expensive object, but it's not like they were unheard of. I'm guessing that the prosecution is trying to suggest that this is some kind of magical object, or just as a general slander to say that Apuleius is full of himself. Next, Apuleius writes love poetry, to which he says, "So, other people write love poetry. Plato wrote love poetry. Love poetry is everywhere. What's so wrong with that?" Next, he dares to use tooth powder from the East to clean his teeth. Roman culture largely is prejudiced against the East, even though they're secretly in love with Eastern culture and they are desperate to adopt it, but they just can't bring themselves to do it because the Eastern people wear pants and that's too weird for them. Apuleius says this is basically not a big deal at all, and it doesn't matter that my tooth powder comes from the East or that my hygiene habits are Eastern in nature. Doesn't prove anything about me. And the last accusation is that he is poor and he doesn't have enough slaves. And there's some back and forth about the number of slaves and the how he came to acquire them or free them or whatever it is. And this is used as evidence that Apuleius may be motivated to improve his financial situation. Marriage in the Roman world came with a dowry. So when the woman gets married, or usually when the girl gets married, her family provides a payment of some kind to her future husband and his family. So they're saying he's got skin in the game, he wanted to do this for money. Apuleius says, well, philosophers like being poor, so if I am poor, I consider it a blessing, but I'm actually not poor, and then he starts talking about how wealthy he is. And those are the frivolous charges brought up against Apuleius. Now to get into the more serious accusations. And the first one, get ready, because this is gonna knock your socks off. A very serious offense. Apuleius bought a weird fish. I know. I know, can you believe it? Alright, sarcasm aside, the accusation is that Apuleius purchased a rare species of fish for an exorbitant amount of money, and the accusation goes that he used this as part of the love spell that he did on Pudentilla. And the prosecution says, we actually know the fishermen who procured the fish for him, and they say that Apuleius told them to get the fish. Now the problem is that the fishermen are not present at the trial, which Apuleius points out. So Apuleius defends this charge with a number of points. First of all, he employs the very legally sound argument of fish are delish. He says, so what if I bought a fish? Maybe I like to eat fish. Lots of people like to eat fish, and they'll even pay top dollar for a really tasty one. So that doesn't make any sense. Next, he says, it's actually for science. You see, I have an intellectual interest in marine life, and I want to study as many species of fish as I can. In fact, Aristotle did this, and I'm doing it too. And as a matter of fact, I've written a book about fish. I'm sure, it's very famous. I'm sure someone here in the audience must have a copy of it on their person right now. And someone does. Was that planted? So he has somebody bring the book and he reads from the book and this is my work on fish, yada yada yada. No magic to be seen here. He says, in fact, fish aren't even used in magic. And then he quotes a bunch of poetry and other works about magic, and he says they talk all about herbs and celestial bodies and gods and all sorts of stuff. They never mention marine life. Nowhere in magic do you see creatures from the sea being used. Now, this is actually not true. There are references to using fish in magic. One comes up in Ovid, and they show up in a couple of other places. So this is just a false claim, whether Apuleius was mistaken or intentionally deceiving. He tries to turn it back around on the prosecution, and he says, if you're saying that you know a way that fish are used in magic, first of all, very cool, would love to know more. Second of all, you must be a magician if you're saying this, because who would know that fish are used in magic other than magicians? So, you're saying I'm a magician? Y'all are magicians. And lastly, he says even if fish were used in magic, not everyone who buys a fish is a magician, so this is not evidence of me being a magician just because I bought a weird fish. The next accusation is that Apuleius bewitched this young boy to have a seizure in front of a bunch of witnesses for the purposes of divination. The prosecution says that we have proof of this because there were 14 boys who were witnesses, and we have asked them to be here today. Apuleius points out that the prosecution never actually questions those boys, so they're just sort of in the courtroom as props, maybe. The prosecution says, well, we have even more boys who saw this. They're just not here right now, but we'll get them, we'll bring them. And Apuleius says, if these boys were so important, if their testimony was so important, why have you not questioned them? And first of all, if I was doing magic, why would I do it in front of so many witnesses? He says the only person who has come forth and said that he saw it in real life was Sicinius Pudens, one of my accusers. Isn't that convenient? He says, no, if I were doing a secret magic ritual, I would not do it in front of 14 boys who could later testify against me in court. The boy in question, the one who had the seizure, it turns out, is epileptic. And if you bothered to question any of these boys, you would see that he is epileptic. In fact, you wanted him to be here today, but he couldn't, because he's sick and he was out of town visiting a specialist. Apuleius goes on to talk about how he knows a lot about epilepsy because he has studied it, and he kind of just spends, several paragraphs talking about how epilepsy comes about and what the symptoms look like and yada yada. He also says that because this boy is epileptic, he's not what you would consider to be ritually pure in Roman religion, which includes divination, by the way. Apuleius points this out. Divination, not illegal. In Roman religion, you want to be working with things that are considered to be pure. And this is true of, say, animal sacrifices, the animals must be blemish-free. And that's true if you want to have like a young boy to be a prophet for you, the boy has to be perfect. So he said this wouldn't even be somebody that you would want to conduct your divination ritual with. He goes on to say that magic isn't even the most effective way to induce epilepsy. Again, I've studied it, Apuleius, and I can tell you that there's all sorts of non-magical ways to induce a seizure if you're working with somebody who's epileptic. Magic is not one of them. It's not the most efficient. And again, he says, to what end would I conduct this ritual in the first place? Now, evidently, the prosecution has brought up a related issue, that Apuleius was consulted by a woman on the advice of her doctor about her epileptic fits. And Apuleius says, yep, that is absolutely true. I did see a woman about her epileptic fits. I asked her about her symptoms, whether there was like ringing in her ears. I questioned her for a little bit, got a sense of her symptoms, gave her some medical advice, and she went on her merry way. He said, I was consulted as a healer. What is the problem with that? Even if I was doing a magic spell on her, which I wasn't, but if I was, what would be so wrong about healing her through magic? He says, I did not induce a seizure in this woman. What purpose would that serve for me? I have no use for giving a woman an epileptic fit. She suffers from this condition, and I was attempting to help her. The next charge is that Apuleius is in possession of a mystery object that he keeps wrapped in a handkerchief at the house of his dead stepson Pontianus. And they say he worships this mystery object like a god. Apuleius says, first of all, you don't even know what the mystery object is. If you knew what it was, you would be able to tell the judge what you saw, but you've never seen it. Yeah, there's a handkerchief thing in Pontianus's house that's mine, sure. I keep it there, unsupervised, where the household staff who have keys to that room are going in there without me even being present at the house. They could look at it anytime they want. They don't bother with it because it's not a big deal and nobody cares. If it were so magical and so powerful, why would I keep it in a place where not only do I not have constant access to it, but anybody could look at it or mess with it? He says, clearly I don't value it enough to be a magical object. Then he says, look, I'm in a lot of mystery cults, okay? You all know that I've been initiated into mystery cults. I've talked about it publicly before. This is just a thing I'm into. And look, mystery cults are weird. And people in mystery cults do weird things. What do you want from me? I'm a weird guy. I have weird stuff. And then what's maybe my favorite defense against this particular charge, he says, look, a man's mystery object is his own business, and what he does with his mystery object is his own business. So I know you want me to tell you what it is, but I'm not telling. Accusation number 4. Apuleius and his friend Quintianus performed magic rites at the house of this guy Junius Crassus. When Junius Crassus was not home, Quintianus was house sitting. They did this magic rite. When Junius Crassus came home, he noticed black smoke on the walls and feathers sort of all over this room. So what does Apuleius have to say about this? First of all, Junius Crassus is a drunken idiot. He's not even here today. Either because he's still drunk, because he's passed out, maybe he's sweating it out in the baths because we all know he's trying to sober up before dinner tonight so he can drink again. Or he's not here because he's embarrassed to show his face in front of you, Judge Claudius Maximus, a man so illustrious and of sound character and austere and ascetic. Either his lifestyle is just embarrassing in front of someone so sound of character, or because he knows that his testimony is crap, and he's embarrassed to be involved in this kind of nonsensical trial. So he sent a written affidavit, which, by the way, the prosecution has not even read out loud because they're embarrassed. Everybody knows they paid Junius Crassus to say this. It's not real. And furthermore, if Junius Crassus were away from his house for quite some time, why did the household staff leave the house in such a messy state all the way until Junius Crassus came back some days later? Wouldn't they clean it up? And my friend Quintianus, who supposedly did this ritual with me, why would he want to mess up the house that he was staying at? Wouldn't he want a nice place to live while he's in town? And lastly, if I'm gonna do a magic ritual, I would much rather do a magic ritual at my own house. Why would I do it at this random guy's house? The next accusation is that Apuleius keeps a spooky skeleton seal that he uses for magical purposes. Apuleius says, actually, this is not a skeleton at all. It's a figurine of Mercury that I had specially commissioned by this very well-known craftsman in town. And he said, my dearly departed stepson Pontianus, in fact, sourced a really nice piece of wood for this to be made out of, because I wanted a little statue of a god, and I let the craftsman pick the god. He said, I just wanted something to carry around that I could address my prayers to, and just sort of keep a little bit of piety on me at all times. In fact, I have it here with me right now. So he presents it and he says, look, as you can all see, it's a figure of Mercury. Apuleius saves the best for last, and he ends with the biggest and most substantial accusation that he seduced his wife Pudentilla with love magic. Evidently, the prosecution has brought up a number of points and pieces of evidence to support this, and Apuleius dismantles them one by one. So I'm going to take it again as Apuleius does, just in order that he brings it up. So the prosecution's first point was that Pudentilla was against the idea of remarrying once her first husband passed away and she was widowed. Apuleius says, no, she wasn't. She and her two sons, while Pontianus was still alive, were all looking for a new husband for her. And then he says to Sicinius Aemilianus, the main accuser, you know, Aemilianus, I have a letter here that you yourself wrote on the subject of Pudentilla's second marriage, and you suggested in this letter, which please let's read it out, you wanted it to be your other brother Clarus. Isn't that interesting? He said Pontianus in particular wanted me to be her second husband. He and I knew each other independently. He was the one that introduced us. I was just passing through town when he approached me and said that I should spend some time. I should stay with them. I fell ill. I was recovering. I ended up being a guest in their house for a year and developed a relationship with Pudentilla that way. He said Pontianus did have a change of heart at one point and tried to back out of what he had said before and tried to get Pudentilla to not marry me after his father-in-law, Herennius Rufinus, who Apuleius says is the worst guy ever, convinced Pontianus that it would be better to keep the inheritance in the family. Now, Rufinus had a motive for wanting the inheritance to stay in the family, because if it went to Pontianus when Pudentilla dies, then Rufinus would get a cut of that, or he would at least have access to that money. So Apuleius says Pontianus was convinced by this terrible man and his god-awful daughter, but eventually he came around and said, no, it's probably better if she just marries Apuleius. And then another reason he gives for Pudentilla wanting to get married, which blows my mind, and I definitely don't have time to go into it, but he says that being a widow made Pudentilla physically ill. Somehow being married was a sign of being healthier. The prosecution evidently brings a letter to the trial that proves that Pudentilla has been bewitched. It's a letter that she wrote herself saying, I've been bewitched and I'm mad. Now, Apuleius says this is taken out of context, so if we could just have the whole letter be read. And he reads a little bit of it, and most of the stuff that he asks to be read in court, or he says he's going to read, we don't have, but we do actually have part of this letter. So I'll put it on the screen here. Pudentilla is responding to the notion that Apuleius is a magician and saying that this is ridiculous, and then kind of sarcastically saying, oh yeah, I've been bewitched, totally nuts, totally head over heels because of magic, yeah, but it's sarcastic. But he doesn't leave it there, lest there be any doubt. He says, first of all, Sicinius Pudens, you're nasty for reading your mom's private correspondences out in public, especially when it has to do with her being in love with a man. Secondly, if she were bewitched by love magic, and I will refer you to my video on love magic, he says if she is under the influence of love magic, then she is clearly out of her mind. And if she's out of her mind, how can we possibly believe what she says? But if you do believe what she says, then she must not be out of her mind. Furthermore, there's no reason to take the out-of-context, offhand comment of one woman, even if you believe it at face value, against all of the other evidence that I have presented today showing that I'm in fact not bewitching her and I'm not a magician. And lastly, he says, we can see in this part of the letter here that she mentions fate. If you believe in fate, then you probably don't believe in magic. The two concepts are inconsistent with one another. So if she believes in fate, she must not even believe that it is possible for me to seduce her. The next point, Pudentilla is too old to get married. She's too old to find a love match. She's what, 60? Apuleius' defense is basically you guys don't know how to do math. And he doesn't actually give an exact number for her age, but he kind of proposes all these ways that they may have gotten the math wrong. The next point is that Apuleius and Pudentilla chose to get married at Pudentilla's country estate rather than in town. And Apuleius says, first of all, this is not illegal, and in fact, country weddings are considered auspicious, so there's nothing wrong with us getting married in the country. And second of all, in truth, we did it to avoid having to have a dinner with all these people that we really don't like, including and especially you, Aemilianus. Sue me for not wanting to have dinner with you, I guess. And then lastly, and this is probably the most significant accusation, is that Apuleius wanted to marry Pudentilla to get a hold of her money. Pudentilla comes from a wealthy family. She has access to a lot of funds that she got when her husband died. Apuleius wants a little piece of that. So this is a pretty interesting accusation because it provides a legitimate motive for Apuleius to want to marry Pudentilla, perhaps against her will. But Apuleius says, let's bring out all of the documents. As you can see here from the documents pertaining to our marriage, her dowry was actually quite small. So it's not like I would have been gaining a lot by having this wedding. In fact, I've lost money since marrying her. He says, I'm a philosopher. I don't even want to be rich. Philosophy is worth more to me than any amount of money that I might get through this marriage. And there was a time when Pudentilla got sick after Pontianus died. She was suffering from all sorts of related ailments and heartbreak, and she drew up a will at that time. And I was there with her, and she wanted to leave everything to me, but I convinced her not to. I said, you really ought to leave everything to your younger son, Pudens, and then make sure that this person and that person, get a slice. So she actually had me down to inherit most everything that she owned, and I convinced her otherwise. So in this way, Apuleius dismantles that last and perhaps most substantial argument, and then he wraps up the speech pretty quickly after that, just basically asking the judge to be reasonable and saying his thank yous and goodbyes, basically. So that is the main substance of the speech. He takes everything that the prosecution has said and he systematically goes through one by one and presents defenses for each piece of the argument. We don't know the outcome of this trial. Our knowledge of the subject ends here. We don't get any clues in anything that Apuleius wrote about a possible exile or consequences or acquittal or anything like that. He does present Claudius Maximus, the judge, as a very reasonable man who understands philosophy, but in the Roman justice system, judges could be bought, Judges could be swayed. We have no way of knowing what Claudius Maximus may have taken from the information presented both by the prosecution and by Apuleius himself, or how he would have made his decision. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think that Apuleius seduced his wife? Do you think that he was a magical practitioner, or was he just a weird dude interested in fish and mystery cults? Let me know in the comments. I'm not going to tell you what I think. I want to know what you guys think. Did he use magic to better his position, or did the prosecution try to take him out in order to gain access to the money themselves? Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've read this, and if you haven't read this, check out the description. I'll link an English translation that is online that you can start to comb your way through. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of the views and the support, especially the comments, so keep those comments coming. This is the end of the Apuleius series, but if you are interested in magic in the ancient world, in religion, belief in general, and all things sort of strange and unusual from Greece and Rome, you can go ahead and subscribe to this channel. I'm posting videos like this all the time. I am going to take a little bit of a break after this one, but I'll be back in a couple weeks talking about all sorts of weird and wacky things from antiquity. So thanks again for watching. I really appreciate you. I'll see you in the next video.